All right. Hi, everyone. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Schell, who's today's EEB seminar speaker. Chris received his bachelor's in psychology from Columbia University in 2009. He was awarded his PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Chicago in 2015, where he worked with Jill Mateo and Rachel Santmeyer. His dissertation was about differential and long-term impacts of biparental effects on offspring personality and hormones in coyotes. He then received an NSF postdoctoral fellowship and worked at the National Wildlife Research Center and Colorado State University on the endocrine and genetic mechanisms that underlie risk-taking behaviors in urban coyotes in Colorado metropolitan areas. He joined the faculty at University of Washington, Tacoma in 2018 as an assistant professor. And some big news, he'll be moving to the ESPM department at Berkeley in this summer, in July 2021. So that's pretty big in recent news. So great, humongous congratulations, Chris. It will be really awesome to have you so close by, and we can have you visit in person when this universe is realigned and we can move around again. So his work incorporates animal personality, behavioral endocrinology, urban ecology, and he combines all these to study the relationship between human carnivore interactions, co-adaptive processes within urban environments. He's extremely collaborative, works closely with cultural institutions, government agencies, wildlife management organizations, and is very active in professional societies, including Animal Behavior Society, where I know him from. And he's really a rising star in integrative biology, animal behavior, and conservation. He secured competitive grants from the NSF, published his work in highly visible journals, and most recently, two notable publications include a paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution on recreating Wakanda by promoting Black excellence in ecology and evolution, which he published with a number of co-authors, including Shane from our department. In addition, he just published a paper in Science about the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban environments, which I believe we'll hear about more today during his talk. Speaking of which, I should let Chris start giving his talk, which is titled Exploring How Society Shapes the Biology of Cities.
Awesome. Thank you, Noah, for that amazing introduction. I'm very much humbled to chat with y'all, and of course always have a very big spot for everything Los Angeles because I was born and raised in LA. So I love y'all. I'm very happy to be a little bit closer to be able to do some collaborative work across all of California. But today I'm going to chat with y'all about some of the emergent work I've been doing and how it's going to apply to hopefully some of the stuff that we'll be doing here in the Bay Area, as well as Los Angeles and several other places. This understanding that society feeds into ecology, which feeds into evolutionary dynamics, and then feeds back into those nature's contributions back to society. And I think the best way to start this is through creating these narrative arcs, these stories that I oftentimes think about for myself and how I got into the sciences in the first place, which many of you likely have seen these photos before. If you have not, it's a really awesome story. It kind of got me into studying coyotes in urban systems in the first place. These photos are taken in 2008 in downtown Chicago off of the Quiznos on State Street. Now, mind you, these aren't photoshopped, right? All of these photos are actual live photos of a live animal that did in fact walk through and into a Quiznos and hopped into the drink cooler. The story goes that as the animal was walking into the establishment, there were some patrons eating their sandwiches. There were some folks working behind the counter. They all stop what they're doing and proceed to slowly back away, as you would say, for instance, if you saw a velociraptor that was somehow about to chase you, right? The animal then hops into the cooler, takes a look around, starts to doze off, falls asleep for a good 45 minutes before animal control comes to escort said animal out of the premises and into a nearby nature area. Fast forward to the semi-present. This photo was taken about maybe 3 months ago now from Chase Bank in Redwood City, so near the Bay Area. There are these two raccoons that somehow broke into said Chase Bank and were able to be in the establishment for quite some time until they had to be chased out of Chase. So I like to think that the dialogue between these two animals is this person, this little individual right here is thinking, hey, we're caught on camera, we gotta go, we gotta go. And this one is like, I'm not leaving until I get what's mine. So I oftentimes think about what makes these individuals relative to other individuals make the decision to hop into a chase or hop into a Quiznos relative to, say, their conspecifics. What is it about individual variation, and what is it about the environment that generates many of these animal stories in cities? The best way to get to that individual narrative and tie it back to the larger city and society, I want y'all to hold that for a second, kind of put yourself in the shoes of an animal while I'll give you this premise and we'll go over data for said premise. The premise being that social inequality is an ecological issue. And by considering it as such, then we start to see how injustices on the landscape that shape, say, society also shape the natural properties of that landscape and all the attributes therein. So to begin that, I oftentimes always use the avatars that are readily available in pop culture. This one is no different. Where Jeff Goldblum here in the first Jurassic Park movie, I would assume that all of y'all have seen it by now, but get ready, start taking notes on what you're watching over the holidays. This is one of them, right? The first Jurassic Park movie, Jeff Goldblum's character Ian Malcolm talks about life finding a way in relation to chaos theory and dinosaurs being able to kind of break out of pins and causing all sorts of chaos, right? Very true kind of Jeff Goldblum fashion. Well, I oftentimes like to think of coyotes and raccoons as my figurative velociraptors in the sense of, yes, indeed, in cities, life is finding a way. So much so that we have many examples across the globe, across many different types of cities that abound, where these organisms are not only surviving in cities, they're thriving. Everything from, say, urban smooth-coated otters that are pictured here to, yes, raccoons in the Pacific Northwest and everything in between. These organisms are adapting to many human-driven factors and attributes in the city that are shaping, here it is again, that individual variation. That's so very important for natural selection that influences the larger fitness of the population. So then we need to very much consider how we generate many of those ecological pressures, everything from, say, noise, food, and light to building densities, socioeconomics, and the like. At the center of all of this, it's important to keep in mind that human beings are the directors and the audience of this particular screenplay. We are the Lin-Manuel Miranda of this joint. We not only cast the entire cast, we put together the rotating stage, we drew the curtains, we composed all the music, we're also acting in this play. We're also observing many of the players act as we ourselves are breaking the fourth and fifth wall. So I oftentimes will provide this photo here of a buck that is chasing somebody who likely was antagonizing this individual animal to really illustrate this point that we are both shaping the landscape by which these animals are interacting and at the same time are experiencing those interactions. To that point, a recent synthesis that several co-authors and I had put together that was recently published in Evolutionary Applications takes a look at this society by ecology by evolution focus and how things like politics and the economy, human health and demographics, culture and education, so on and so forth influence habitat modification, connectivity, preference and selection, all of the things we oftentimes talk about in eco-evo circles that then influence the ecology and the evolution therein of those species that feed back as nature's contributions, oftentimes often thought of as ecosystem services or disservices towards society. Good examples that I'm just going to extract here a little bit from that Evo Apps paper. One is taking a look at mosquitoes and how mosquitoes are abundant in different areas across the landscape due to urban heterogeneity, as well as the influence of community dynamics on their abundances and what that means for disease dynamics. So, for instance, a recent paper that was published by Katz et al. In 2019 took a look at this urban heterogeneity across the landscape, specifically the relative proportion of standing water to impervious surfaces in Baltimore. And what they found was that in low income neighborhoods, there tend to be a greater proportion of impervious surfaces and also greater proportions of standing water. This is all important because it doesn't take much for a mosquito to be able to breed successfully and then be able to flourish and grow in their abundances. Here is the other piece of this equation. In these low income environments, many of the predators that would be eating these mosquitoes, they're gone. They're gone because they themselves don't have the refugia that's necessary to stay in those environments. All of this is important because what Katz and colleagues found was that in those low-income regions in Baltimore, these mosquito populations are reproductively more successful, their growth rate is greater, and their body size is larger. That's all important because it influences their ability to pass on zoonoses. So these zoonotic diseases that transfer from one organism to the next goes through the roof. So that means the ability to, say, have to manage disease and manage those populations gets fairly hampered. That paired with the fact that there are societal underpinnings that bias where the resources actually go. So whereas the rich get richer in terms of, say, stewardship and management resources, many low-income communities oftentimes are using individual types of pest management and perhaps maybe not using it consistently that can influence the way in which insecticide resistance starts to propagate throughout the population. This example is very similar to that what we see for brown rats in multiple cities, including Detroit and New Orleans. So a combination of multiple studies have recently shown how the distribution of food and waste paired with heterogeneity in building vacancies can increase rodent abundances in specific regions. And again, here we go with the difference in the socioeconomic gradients. Low income neighborhoods tend to have the greatest density of these building vacancies paired with food and waste generally, right? That influences where the rodents are. Also, that changes where the predators are. So the individual and the broad scale use of rodenticides not only can have potentially the same effect of what we see in mosquitoes, but also can be biomagnified up through trophic levels. So it not only affects the rodents, but say, for instance, there's sublethal effects where the rodents that are ingesting those rodenticides don't die, but they are severely hampered in terms of their movement. Easy pickings for a bobcat or a coyote that rolls through the environment. And they also can feel the effects of those rodenticides. So again, these combinations of ecological, sociological, and evolutionary dynamics all influence the way in which potentially, say, for instance, One Health in the environment and epidemiology focus potentially influence the way in which we manage those species accordingly. All of that comes to one really fundamental tenet, this idea of structure. So I kind of talked a little bit about urban heterogeneity in those previous case studies, but now I want y'all to focus here a little bit on really thinking about structure. And, I'm kind of burying the lead a little bit, but thinking about the significance of structure of trees. So where the vegetation is. I provide for you a photo of cherry blossom trees on UW Seattle's campus, because I want you now to think about this new avatar, the Lorax. So Dr. Seuss's Lorax is the speaker of the trees. If you have not gotten the chance to read the book as a child, do yourself a favor, read the book, or here's another thing for your notes list. 2013, a DreamWorks Dr. Seuss Lorax was dropped with none other than Danny DeVito playing the Lorax. Talk about a good casting, right? So I want y'all to think like Danny DeVito, aka the Lorax, not Sunny in Philadelphia, Danny DeVito, Lorax, Danny DeVito, and follow the trees in these next two photos that I show you side by side that are no more than a half mile away from each other. All right. So these photos are taken from the Tacoma region. The photo on the left is one of a township right up against Tacoma called University Place. The one on the right is of southeast Tacoma. Now, if you're the Lorax and I were to ask you the question, think this in your head, right? Where is the greatest amount of tree cover or vegetation? You'd instantly say the photo on the left. Looks pretty obvious. I bet if you grew up in a city writ large, you probably know where I'm going with this as I ask you the next question, which is, which of these neighborhoods would you predict has a higher median household income or per capita income? You probably wouldn't flinch. You likely would say the photo on the left, right? That intrinsic idea or understanding that we have that wealth is connected to greater vegetation cover, greater, say, lots, has a name. It's called the luxury effect. This idea that species richness and biodiversity are positively associated with wealth. Now, mind you, we're going to get into the reasons why that's not always the case for all examples. But before we do, I think it's important to just note, if this is the first time you've heard of the luxury effect before, it should be noted that wealth structures ecological communities worldwide. Again, not just in the contiguous 48 states. It's in many cities globally. And if this, again, this is the first time you heard of this, guess what? I just did you a solid and put together an entire literature review right here of all of the different trophic levels that are influenced by this luxury effect. From primary producers, everything from, say, tree canopy cover, which we kind of just alluded to, yes, even native tree abundance, all the way up to tertiary consumers that influences mammalian occupancy. Should be noted here, I study mammals. I consider myself a mammalogist. I was certainly trained by a ton of mammalogists like Bruce Patterson at Field Museum. So I think about mammals quite a bit. And to that point, what we've been doing of late in combination with the Grit City Carnivore Project and the Urban Wildlife Information Network is using these camera traps. So these essentially non-invasive types of tech in order to understand where the animals are going and then tie different landscape level covariates to occupancy, to detection and colonization events. To give you a brief preamble of what UN is and what we do, essentially the UN network is this large partnership of multiple cities using very similar kind of urban to rural transect gradients to understand and monitor wildlife and their ecology and their behavior writ large. Now, mind you, I showed you kind of the cameras, but we do a lot of other things as well that we're starting to add on in terms of our repertoire. We're also using small mammal trapping, auditory sampling, bat monitoring, so on and so forth. And at this point, we have about 29 cities and counting, with hopefully a couple of additional cities that will be in Mexico and Canada and Africa as well. To give you a bird's eye view of what Tacoma looks like for us, we've been monitoring urban mammals since fall of 2018. This map here to the top left just shows you a couple of dots in yellow of all of the camera trap sites where we have surveyed accordingly. We have added on some sites since this photo has been taken, but should be noted that at any given point in time in the seasonal blocks that we have, with our fall being October, our winter coming up here being January, our spring being April, and then our summer being July, we'll set cameras out for 30 to 35 days, and at any given point in time have 29 to 36 cameras. You may be curious as to why there's a little bit of wiggle room in that amount of cameras. That's particularly because as you're working in urban systems, you're not just avoiding the animals and camera damage from non-human organisms, but also damage from human organisms. Certainly, if y'all have questions later, I could talk to you about all of the many stories of what it's like to work in urban systems. And we get many photos that look like this, right? The classic kind of archetypes of what you've seen from wildlife ecology, from black-tailed deer to raccoons moving through the landscape, coyotes that are investigating the lure that we put on, opossums do the same. My favorite photo personally is this one that we had that's really close to UW-Tacoma's campus, maybe about 3 or 4 blocks away, of these raccoons practicing their parkour. And y'all know I could not give you a talk without showing you the cute and cuddly, because my dissertation, as Noah had pointed out, was on puppies. Like I literally had a dissertation on puppies. So I'm going to show you baby animals to just hype up the idea of how awesome cameras can be, not just for still images, but also for video. Notice the date on this, right? March 9th, 2020. So one of the things that we're working on right now is also seeing how changes in just the way in which people move across the landscape influence the way in which animals move across the landscape. So in these next few slides, I'm going to show you some preliminary data from a citywide analysis that UN is conducting right now. We actually are in the process of writing and editing the first draft, so that way we can get it out for peer review here in short order. But I'm going to show you just data right now from Seattle and Tacoma. So at the top here is Seattle, at the bottom is Tacoma. The x-axis for both of these is income scaled by a cost of a one-bedroom apartment, whereas the y-axis is species richness. So the number of species that we were able to count at each of the site, with each of these black dots representing one camera site across our landscape. If you're curious and you want to ask more later, I'm more than happy to verse you on the stats that we use, but briefly, we just use a Bayesian occupancy model, and much of these correlational relationships are based off of the posterior distribution of that particular model. So what you'll see here is these Pearson correlation coefficients, which are matched back to the posterior distributions with the 95% confidence intervals. And even here in a region as green as, you know, the evergreen state in these two cities, we are still seeing this relationship between income and species richness, where in both cities, there's a positive relationship. Now, mind you, it's stronger in Seattle than it is in Tacoma. Why that's the case? We're still investigating that, but it should be noted up to this point, we've been talking a lot about luxury effect and biotic features, but many of those features, many of the wealth influencing, say, ecology also influences the abiotic features of the environment as well. So I like to call this particular segment of the talk the Avatar Last Airbender, because we kind of really already got into Earth a little bit here, talking about, I mean, it's not actual like Earth movement, but y'all get what I'm saying, right? We'll talk about water and we'll talk about air and we'll talk about fire, because literally at every scale, there are these wealth disparities in terms of where the resources are and how they're distributed accordingly. So let's start with fire, figuratively, right? The fire here is thinking about urban heat island effects. This idea that urban heat islands, right, urban areas generally tend to be 3 to 10 degrees hotter Celsius than their rural environments or non-urban environments. That's particularly because of the distribution of impervious surface cover relative to the amount of green space cover, which influences all of these processes like heat absorption and retention, plant transpiration, and water evaporation from the soil, and water penetration. If we were to take, say, surface temperatures and look at it across a particular city for each census block, and then compare that to income gradients, what you see is something that looks a little bit like this. Now, I just want to point out here that this resource provided by NPR looks at multiple cities, including, I believe, many cities in California. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, where you can look at maps that say, look at cooler to hottest surface temperatures and then median income. And what we see oftentimes is that regions that have the hottest surface temperatures also tend to have the smallest amount of income. That is, again, due to this fact of there's reduced environmental cooling in those regions, right? There's greater impervious surface cover. So let's move on to air. So air, in many studies, and one study here I'm going to pull out in particular, oftentimes pollution inequity is disproportionately influencing Black and Brown communities relative to others. And one of the recent papers that came out from Christopher Tessum et al. In 2019, Chris and colleagues took a look at this really interesting pollution inequity index, where, should be noted in this paper, they controlled for income differences. So we're starting to kind of chip away at income as a proxy, right? Let me kind of orient you to this figure. So on the x-axis is year. So they're looking at pollution equity at every year from 2000 to 2015. The pollution equity index essentially states that if you are above this line, right, if you're above 0, then that means that specific population of peoples is experiencing more pollution burden than they are consuming and generating air pollution. Whereas if you're below this 0 line, then you are generating more air pollution than you are being burdened by it. This blue line, this pale blue line, is for white Americans across the many cities that were surveyed. This orange line is for Latinx Americans. This green line is for Black Americans. So over a 15-year period, again, controlling for income, what we see is that the pollution inequity index is greatest for communities of color relative to white communities within multiple cities. This is all incredibly topical right now as we're thinking about COVID and climate change, as we're all sitting in our rooms or our bedrooms, right, having this virtual seminar, because we know that air pollution, for instance, is linked to the contraction of COVID and whether or not you die from COVID. One of the recent papers that was published by one of my colleagues, Kimberly Terrell, this year took a look at the air pollution hazard. So really just the amount of PM 2.5 in the atmosphere generally in Louisiana, and they looked at the rate of death from COVID-19. This strip of land along the Mississippi River is called Cancer Alley, in particular because many toxic waste sites are co-located along this stretch of land. It should also be noted that in many of these regions, many of these census blocks, there are predominantly Black communities. That is not by accident. After the emancipation, during Southern Reconstruction, when many institutions were put together to segregate white and Black communities, there were many populations of Black folks that were segregated to areas that looked like this, and EPA regulations were completely relaxed. So then that way the amount of industrial waste and pollutants could be placed along this region of land with nobody saying anything, right? Government sponsored pollution and environmental racism towards these communities that has now to this day influenced who is dying from COVID. pair that with climate change, here, this for us is very topical as fires continue to burn in the Southland. So this photo here on the left is from the San Francisco Bay region, right? And that was taken maybe about 2-3 months ago. The photo on the right is from Blade Runner 2049 with Ryan Gosling. I mean, normally most people would say they would want to be with Ryan Gosling, but like for real though, I'd rather be with Ryan Gosling right now. This photo looks a lot better than current projections. So these questions are ones that we're going to need to be having and discussing as the world continues to be on fire. And those that are feeling the inequity, that pollution inequity that we just talked about, the burden is going to fall greatest on those disenfranchised and minoritized communities. And then finally, water. Really, these photos need no captions. It should be noted that the Flint, Michigan water crisis is still ongoing, right? So the fact that there were government-sponsored policies that were put in place that disenfranchised specific communities, predominantly communities of color, that influenced their water quality. So just the access to clean water is difficult because of the fact that there are so many policies that are put in place that don't allow or afford the same ecosystem services for everybody. Which gets us into why the luxury effect is great to a point, right? It's good to a point. Here I provide for you a figure from a recent meta-analysis that was done by Curis et al. In 2020, where they separate all of the luxury effect studies that were recently done by flora and fauna, and then they look at land use consideration here at the top, as well as density, so how densely packed a city is versus how sprawling or sparse it is. And then they look at whether or not the specific study looked at had a positive relationship, a neutral relationship, meaning wealth was not related to species richness or biodiversity at all, or a negative relationship where the wealthier a neighborhood got, the reduction you saw in species richness and biodiversity. And it's not universal that we should expect a positive relationship. It, in fact, changes as a function of land use consideration and as a function of density. And it's not the same across flora and fauna, which then makes us dig a little bit deeper in the sense of understanding the biases that generated the wealth disparities in the first place. If we can't unpack, say, structural racism and classism and the way in which law enforcement and residential segregation and resource allocation and immigration policy all are influenced by systemic biases, which all influence everything we just talked about, right? So impervious surface cover, urban heat islands, green space and tree cover, all the way up to disease dynamics are all influenced by the way in which society makes decisions on the landscape. Legacies or contemporary policies that are baked into the concrete that influence the eco and evo processes that we're observing. It's important for us not only to be cognizant of these, but also because it influences the way in which we do our sampling. So if you're an ecologist or you're an evolutionary biologist and you're working in a city, if you only sample in the richest parts of a city, you're not capturing the full picture. In fact, you're capturing only a small snippet of that picture, where if you were to make, say, recommendations to a management organization, they would not hold up because you're only looking at one segment of the city, which gets us into kind of the final avatar of this particular talk. Many of you may know this, but maybe not. And here's another thing to put on your list of things to watch over the holiday break, right? So the recent Watchmen HBO series has a really interesting take on blending history with an alternate future. But here's the kicker, right? This particular wallpaper is showing Regina King's character, Sister Night. And in the first episode, in the first 10 minutes of the first episode, they get into actual US history, the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. To give you a brief preamble of what the Tulsa Massacre was and what happened during that period of time, there was a particular case where a Black man was alleged to have assaulted a white woman in a hotel room, immediately taken to prison. There were rumblings going on of said Black man to be lynched the very next day. So members of his community came to his defense against the allegations that were set upon him. And after a few hours, were peacefully walking away. But as they were doing so, were accosted by a mob of white men that would then proceed to shoot up the entire town of Tulsa and bomb it to the ground. 300 plus people lost their lives. Thousands of others were displaced from the region. At the period of time where this happened, before the actual Tulsa Massacre, Tulsa was considered the Black Wall Street of America. This is important because it's unfortunately not the only time that something like this has happened. There are instances in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, and several other major cities where government sponsored policies, whether de facto, so unofficial, or de jure, on the books official, changed the way in which the landscape is shaped fundamentally. That influences the history by which we are understanding these organisms thriving and surviving, right? We talked at the very beginning of this talk, individual variation and how the environment influences those organisms. So if we're ecologists and we're thinking about the individual and the environment, we have to understand the history, which gets us into one of the perhaps more well-known policies that were sponsored by the US government, this policy known as redlining, that was sponsored by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and then signed off by the US federal government, which was a systematic denial of various services to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods or communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. So many of my forefathers and ancestors would share stories about how if they had the economic mobility, they would go to neighborhoods that are here in green and blue, designated as A or B regions, and real estate agents would refuse to show homes to them, would sometimes hide in their cars and spy on them and say, these uppity Black folks are trying to buy homes in our neighborhoods. These A and B regions were only designated for predominantly wealthy, predominantly white communities, whereas the C and D regions were normally called hazardous areas, and Black and brown communities were relegated to those areas. You could probably guess where most of the EPA regulations were severely relaxed and toxic waste sites were placed in these red and yellow areas, right? This is a map of Oakland. And I implore you, if this is the first time you're hearing about redlining, to check out this book, The Color of Law, written by Richard Rothstein. But also, I provide for you this resource here put together by the University of Richmond called the Mapping Inequality Project, where they show all of the cities that have been redlined in the past and what those maps look like. Here, I'm just going to highlight for you Tacoma and Seattle, as well as San Francisco and Oakland. Because as an ecologist, thinking about how animals move across this landscape makes me think about, okay, well, where would the green space be greatest? Where would, say, for instance, the trees that take hundreds of years to grow be retained? They're likely going to be in those A and B graded regions, those green and blue areas. So where are potentially the source habitats in a city? Likely going to be in these regions. This is all likely going to influence things like genetic connectivity, population substructuring, habitat fragmentation, sink and source dynamics, right? All of these questions that we oftentimes will answer in traditional eco-evo literature, but now are able to say, all right, well, we have these maps. Let's explore this further. I'm not pulling this out of thin air, right? There's a recent preprint that was put together by Dexter Locke and colleagues that takes a look at tree canopy cover across these A through D graded regions. And in almost every city they surveyed, 37 of them in total, these A regions oftentimes and sometimes B regions customarily have greater tree canopy cover relative to the C and D graded regions. Imagine what that can do if you're the Lorax to all the animals that live in the environment and where they can survive and thrive. Imagine what that does to the community assemblages they're in. So at the beginning of this talk, if y'all remember, I had started you with the premise that social inequality is an ecological issue. Hopefully at this point, I've convinced you of that. And if we accept that premise, then environmental justice and anti-racism are perhaps the best tools that we have in our toolkit to do urban conservation and sustainability effectively. I would argue that it is the base, it's the foundation by which we do our work. And here I say urban as a qualification, but it should be noted that environmental justice and anti-racism extends beyond the urban boundaries of any city, right? It extends into the pristine environments that we consider to not be touched by people. Newsflash, right? There is no place on this planet Earth that isn't touched by the human footprint. Therefore, in order for us to do a better job at our jobs as scientists, we need to center justice and anti-racism, which means thinking about deconstruction, reconciliation, and community mobilization at the forefront of what we do. And that means dipping back into our past, learning from our ancestors about civil rights and what that means for us in our current context, and how that should be a prerequisite for environmental health that helps to generate better health for all organisms. Should be noted, right? This conversation has been going on for quite some time. We oftentimes think of civil rights, folks then immediately go to the 60s, but it's happened before then, it's happened after then, and there are many undercurrents of folks in these conversations that will continue to have these conversations. I urge and implore you, for those of you that are social scientists on this call, appreciate all y'all. For those of you that are natural scientists, go talk to your social scientists, because they'll give us an education on much of this. I'll just give you a brief kind of overview of the environmental justice movement to put this in context about how we take conservation success and the lessons from environmental justice and our forefathers and implement them accordingly. So from the 70s to the 80s, Dolly Burwell, Reverend Leon White, and Reverend Ben Chavez, under the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, came together and organized around toxic waste sites, specifically in the Carolinas, because many of those waste sites were being distributed in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Should be noted, Warren County was one of them. And during the 1982 Warren County landfill protest, there were many members of the church that had laid down their bodies on the road as these trucks were starting to bring in PCBs into what was, at that time, Warren County was a 62%, again, predominantly Black county. So all of the PCBs from the state and from surrounding states were being flushed into that county, which led to many of the movements that would ultimately lead to the 1991 Environmental Leadership Summit that established the original 17 environmental justice principles that we still talk about today. So delegates to the first national people of color in this Environmental Leadership Summit all came together, as well as indigenous leaders, to draft these 17 principles. If you have not seen them before, you likely have seen them in different forms that are being adopted, co-opted, the narrative changed by many, say, for-profit organizations. One of those being, say, for instance, ethical, balanced, and sustainable use of land and renewable resources, right? That's been in the news quite a bit of late, but it should be noted, these conversations have been had again since the civil rights era. Acts of environmental injustice should be a violation of international law. The UN definitely states this, but I could say America's not following it. The establishment of urban and rural policies that clean up and rebuild in balance with nature. So if you heard of Superfund sites, right? The idea for Superfund sites came from these environmental justice principles. So our responsibility as conservationists, ecologists, and evolutionary biologists then means to take those principles and translate them in ways that allow us to understand how we build equitable capital and fight poverty. Those, in fact, will help us achieve the greatest conservation success. So for instance, increasing affordable housing, right? Societal policy. It's not restricted to just people. It can increase ecological stability via reduced displacement and gentrification of human communities that allows for greater ecological stability for non-human organisms. Accessible healthcare influences positively the general health of human populations, which should have trickle-down effects to influencing other non-human organisms and their overall health, as seen under that One Health framework. Everything also down to strengthening voting rights. If we can amplify the voices of those that are most marginalized and disenfranchised in these conversations, then and only then are we able to see this conservation success. Should be noted that all of these conversations, right, they start with us, they start with you and I, and they're not unachievable. They really aren't. It really just takes us thinking about how we subvert the way in which we consider how we do our work, how we expand all of the network connections that exist between, say, this past election and what's going to happen 20 years from now. It's all connected. It quite literally is, to the point that I oftentimes think to myself, right, I started this entire journey, I started this entire talk with just one individual animal, that Quiznos coyote. I'll show you in church. This animal, this puppy here is 7 weeks old. He's one of my favorite. We gave him the nickname Kal-El. Hopefully Shane is on this call, because Shane, you'll get this, right? Kal-El is the birth name of Clark Kent, AKA Superman, because puppy was straight up fearless. This puppy is maybe no more than 10 feet away from me, eventually what you're going to see is I'm going to pan over to the rest of the family. Apologies for the choppiness. Really, you're going to see, okay, you see this one puppy who's close, sniffing nonchalantly. Ultimately, what happens, you see the rest of the family, siblings and parents, look at where they are. They're hanging out in the back saying like, you got this, Cal. We're good, man. We're going to hang back here while you do your thing. So this question on individual variation and animal personality led me to think about the mechanisms that shape the behaviors that I see from these animals, because it influences at the base core, right? That variation we talk about for natural selection. So then it makes you think, okay, well, what are influencing the mechanisms that are shaping the behavior? That makes you lead to the environment. What are the environmental drivers that shape the mechanisms, physiology, genetics, or otherwise, that shape that behavior, which then leads you to think about, well, what are those mosaics and how are those mosaics structured across the landscape? You immediately go to landscape ecology and community ecology. Then you start to think about, okay, well, there are these environmental mosaics across the city. Like, why do those exist? Which then helps you to get further and further down that rabbit hole to say, these legacies, that environmental heterogeneity within the city is quintessentially human. And it's human in the sense of it starts to make us look into the mirror, like the Michael Jackson song, right? Man in the mirror, about how our cities, how they're structured, don't just influence us. They influence the organisms around us, and they will continue to do so. So using that, we can leverage those lessons from our forefathers, from our ancestors, leverage those lessons from Cal here in order to better understand how we do our jobs and how we do so in a science activism mindset. So with that, I'd like to thank all y'all for coming to the seminar today. All of my UW collaborators, Point Defiant Zoo and Aquarium, my UN collaborators, everybody in the Socio-Eco Evo network, SIAS, my community partners, and of course, my new partners in SBUM at UC Berkeley, and I will open for any questions y'all may have. Also, note that email address is likely going to change here in short order, but the Twitter handle will not, so shameless plug there.
Thank you so much for that incredible and inspiring talk, Chris. It was wonderful. We already have one question we can start with, but basically, if you all have questions, you can either raise your hand and I'll monitor the participants and I can unmute you if you want to talk, or you can just put it in the Q&A and we can just read them out and have Chris answer. So either way, if you want to be unmuted and talk, raise your hand in the participant panel. And if you just want to put in your question in the Q&A, just pop it in there. So I think let's start. The first question you had while you were giving the talk was about the conflicts you might have with humans messing around with cameras. You gave us a little teaser there, and I think you have someone falling for it.
Yeah. There are so many stories, but I'll share the one that I think was the most kind of endearing when I first got to the Tacoma site. So we had folks on camera on one of our sites that was in Southeast Tacoma previously, but the camera wasn't tampered with in the first 2 weeks that we checked it. But after the second 2 weeks, we came back, the camera was gone. And what was interesting about that specific story, we've had many a camera stolen in Tacoma, but the first camera we ever had stolen at the site were stolen bolt cutters. So somebody must have seen the camera where it was, stole some bolt cutters to then steal the camera, then left the stolen bolt cutters at the site. So we have taken the stolen bolt cutters and hung them up on our wall just as a reminder of like, yep, this is urban ecology. Certainly there are other stories I have of course, we have many folks just flashing us on camera. So there are people giving us like private pics in front of the camera, urinating in front of said camera. Luckily, nobody has actually urinated on the equipment, which is great. It's amazing that I'm asking for like just not to pee on the equipment. And everything from like just public urination and exposure to folks somehow not noticing there's a camera there and having sex in front of the camera, and doing drug deals in front of said camera. So it gets a little tricky when you're like, okay, well, you got this on camera. Are we obligated and responsible to send it to the authorities now? Yeah, it's interesting to say the least.
Thanks for sharing all those. Dan Bloomstein has a question. I think I'll unmute him, and then we have a few more coming after that too.
Yeah.
Dan, you can unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Dan.
Great talk. Really stimulating, wonderfully interdisciplinary. I'm wondering, going back to one of your early examples about mosquitoes and wealth, in a place like Los Angeles, water and vegetation and irrigation is concentrated in wealthier habitats and areas and neighborhoods. I'm wondering if you might get a reverse relationship in a place like LA between mosquitoes and health.
Yeah,
Mosquitoes and wealth.
yeah, I'd be really curious to see if there is that change in structure, because Los Angeles and Baltimore, the way in which they're structured, as you mentioned, Dan, very different, right? So the concentration of where, say, like stormwater is and the way in which irrigation systems work may change where the mosquitoes are distributed across the landscape. What would be really interesting is to do that type of study that Katz et al. Did in LA, that's more sprawling, but then also in New York. Right. So Baltimore and New York are also very different, even though their histories, they're relatively kind of the same in terms of age. I'd be real curious to find what that looks like, paired with, I think, some of the conversations you and I have had, as well as several others, about the way in which domestic cats influence that landscape and domestic pets generally. So, you know, my bread and butter is behavioral ecology and how coyotes come into conflict with people, which led me to this interdisciplinary work. But Los Angeles and the Bay Area and just California generally is a hotbed when it comes to, say, like cat conflict with birds, which would be the organisms eating those mosquitoes. So at least we know here in Tacoma, most of the wealthier neighborhoods tend to have the greater density of outdoor cats. So there may be a relationship where there are more mosquitoes in those wealthier neighborhoods because of the greater abundance of, say, irrigation systems paired with the kind of indirect effects of outdoor cats.
Which is a perfect example of the interplay between sort of, culture and cultural norms and biodiversity outcomes that have sort of, trickle down effects across all sorts of things. Yeah. So, I mean, I was thinking from a drought perspective, but you're absolutely right. Where it's culturally acceptable to have a cat outside, hopefully nowhere, but, nonetheless, right. That can change dynamics as well.
Yeah, the drought perspective is really interesting too when you pair it with climate change. That would be fascinating. We got tons of studies to do, Dan. Tons.
Follow it up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great talk.
We have a question from Maddie asking about the Bay Area and whether you're going to continue your camera carnivore surveys in the East Bay and or continuing in the Tacoma area.
Yes. Yeah. So both. So we still have cameras up in the Tacoma area, and we'll have cameras up in the East Bay and in just San Francisco Bay region as well. So luckily with the UN network, we already had partners with the Oakland Zoo and the San Francisco Zoo that were putting up cameras and have put together these urban to rural transects. So we've got quite a bit of a head start here. There are also some collaborators that are doing some collaring work as well in the Bay Area. So we're going to kind of expand base of operations a little bit.
Awesome. We have two questions from Jenny. One is, does the Urban Wildlife Information Network have a database that is available to view? And have you used data from applications like iNaturalist to study urban ecology?
Great questions. Yeah. So the UN database really is, I think at the moment, because we're compiling much of the first database, is not open yet for kind of open data source type of use. However, if you have a collaborator, which there are folks all across the Southland that are working on many different networks, including in Los Angeles, Pasadena, Long Beach, and maybe eventually San Diego, just getting connected with them like allows you to tap into all the resources across the entire network. So we're super collaborative in that regard. What was the second question, Noah?
It was about iNaturalist.
iNaturalist, yes, thank you. So we have been piloting some of the community science work with having folks monitor where carnivores are, specifically coyotes and raccoons, but more broadly, just carnivores generally, through iNaturalist and also through Carnivore Spotter, which was originally created by Robert Long and Mark Jordan at Woodland Park Zoo and also at Seattle University. And their data we found just through not only community surveys, but also word of mouth, is that iNaturalist is great to a point. It tends to be a barrier for more diverse communities to participate, particularly because we don't have a lot of folks wanting to have to go through the rigmarole of creating a particular sign in and then remembering their sign in and then working through the clunky system. The UX design of iNaturalist is not great, whereas the carnivore spotter program that was put together by Robert and Mark is really easy and intuitive, web-based, and you can do it much easier on your phone with less load time. So the hope is to kind of compare and contrast the two. We already know that there are folks using iNaturalist across the region. And also we have collaborators that are looking at how even the community science is racially and economically biased, because the regions where we have most of the coverage tend to be in the wealthiest neighborhoods, where the people that have the ability to participate, which are the ones that oftentimes have more economic capital, are doing so. So that's a long way of saying that, yes, we are looking at iNaturalist data, and it's not perfect, but we're starting. We're making a start.
Cool. We have a question from Morgan, building off of Dan's question. So he's asking whether there are common laws, for example, environmental features that describe how SES and biodiversity are co-distributed across urban areas. So you mentioned trees, but are there others, possibly elevation?
Yeah, we don't know many of the common laws really at all, except for a few that were recently put together in a meta-analysis done by Chamberlain et al. So they found that precipitation tends to be really important in the studies that were previously published. So areas that are more arid tend to have more pronounced luxury effects. That kind of makes sense, because if water is the limiting factor and those that are wealthier tend to have more access to water, then those regions are by virtue likely going to have greater vegetation, which likely is going to mean more fauna in the region. There also seems to be a relationship between species provenance and this luxury effect. So I had been talking a lot about species richness and biodiversity broadly, but if you look at a greater, finer scale, you tend to see that there are these distributions across a landscape where, yes, these wealthier neighborhoods may have greater species richness, but there are more exotic or non-native species. So folks are planting, or species that wouldn't actually be there to begin with. So maybe vegetation diversity is through the roof, but when it comes to bird diversity or mammalian diversity, it kind of levels out. That's what we're seeing, at least in our UN analysis so far, is that some cities have really pronounced luxury effects and some negligible. And we tried to look at precipitation, didn't really show much of anything. So for many of the studies that have been published before, yeah, precipitation and species provenance seem to play a role, but there are really no universal kind of trends that we're seeing so far, other than the fact of wealth in and of itself doesn't predict much of anything, and urbanization is likely going to be more important, meaning specifically that relative distribution of impervious surfaces to vegetation cover.
Cool, thanks. Just a couple more questions. We have one from Sean McGowan. I missed some of the beginning of the talk, so forgive me if I missed this. With the close relationship between green space, higher quality, habitat, and environmental health with the wealth of neighborhoods, communities, we've been able to track these factors with gentrifying neighborhoods. For example, as wealth within a neighborhood increases, what are the effects of the local ecology, environmental health, and effect of people being displaced?
Yep. We don't have data on it yet, but it is on the docket. It's one of the top 5 things that we have with the UN network, as well as with some of the LTERs that are being conducted. So the Central Arizona Phoenix LTER is doing some of that work, which Jesse Lewis, one of our close collaborators, is heading up the kind of Phoenix Tempe region transect that's also under UN. So the hope is, yeah, we will be able to take a look at that. And we have cameras in some of the regions that are the fastest growing and the fastest gentrifying ever, including Tacoma and the Phoenix Tempe region and Los Angeles and many of these cities that are quickly becoming monoculture. So we don't have answers yet, but I imagine it's going to play some role.
And maybe the last one, so Tanya Kane is asking, Okay, so just providing an anecdote that it seems like people in my neighborhood in Burbank are reporting more coyote sightings and bolder coyote behavior during COVID. Maybe this is because people are home more and more aware, or maybe because there is generally less human activity right now, so coyote is strolling about more. Have you noticed any patterns in the data? And relates to, I was, thinking about this too, is I'm sure you've been thinking about COVID and how reduced movement is going to affect, kind of mentioned it, but it would be great to hear what you think about.
Yeah, I'll say that it's not universal that coyotes in particular are getting bolder or changing their activity patterns temporally or spatially across cities. And I say that because it really just depends on how people in a specific city use their urban landscape. So if we're to compare, say, Burbank to Tacoma, Burbank and just the general Southland period, the way in which folks changed their behavior and the policies that generated those changes influenced where they were walking through green spaces relative to where they were in downtown spaces. Now, because in those regions, the amount of green spaces right up against those downtown areas, Burbank is a really good example, right? Because the foothills are right there. Coyotes have a really interesting history in that region already because of the sparse distribution of anthropogenic food resources, domestic cats, and how people interact with those coyotes. So all of a sudden, a bunch of people that were outside and driving around are now confined within a mile of their home, and they're staying in said home. So coyotes are starting to venture out quite a bit more because of the fact that there's reduced vehicular activity and reduced human activity generally across these green spaces. Here's where Tacoma is different. When the stay-at-home orders were put in place, people relatively stayed in their homes. They didn't really go to the downtown areas, but they went to their green spaces quite a bit, to the point where many of the sites where we had cameras before the pandemic, we would notice a fourfold increase in the number of people we got on camera. So coyotes that used to be at a site at any given point in time during the day and at night were no longer found in some of our more reliable sites to find those animals. There also weren't really any reports of any coyotes coming into conflict with people. Folks would see them here or there, but it wouldn't be anything more than normal. And we have iNaturalist data and carnivore spotter data that verify that, right? There aren't more sightings of coyotes in those regions. So it seems to be city to city specific. What that unifying thread is, I think, is the way in which people use their green spaces. So stay tuned. Hopefully by the summer of next year, we'll have an answer for you.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again so much for this fantastic talk, and we look forward to having you here in person and these conversations because they're really great and really influence everyone's work at so many levels. So with that, I think we'll have others even hop into the meeting with the graduate students.
Awesome.
So let me know if you need help finding that link.
Yeah, thank you all for your time. I appreciate you.